When Gaz was just a teenager, he found himself pulled towards the life on the streets of Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone.
I find myself in that ghetto, regularly going there to smoke marijuana. At the same time, hanging out with those street guys.
What attracted you to the life of the ghetto?
The way the flow of the ghetto, like every day you go to a certain place, you're buying stuff that you cannot afford to buy. Some will do good to you. You will see them spending money they will be having from street games.
Good lifestyle, like money.
Yeah, like money. And at the same time, the admiration that people have for them that will spend those money, all gangsters. So, yeah, I said, okay.
Gaz lived this lifestyle too, for years, as the head of his own street gang in Freetown. But then his life took a different turn. In this week's episode, we find out about the hidden world of gangs through the stories of a few people who, like Gaz, joined them and came out the other side. We'll explore what draws young people into gangs around the world, the struggles they face when trying to leave, and how some use their gang experiences to start a new life. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Dennis Rogers has spent decades studying youth gangs across Latin America.
It all started when I went to Nicaragua in the mid-90s to carry out research for my PhD.
Dennis was looking into how poor people in urban centres support each other in their communities. And as part of his research, he'd regularly walk through the Nicaraguan capital, Managua, to observe and engage with local people.
I kind of encountered gangs as a major element in the social reality there and acquired the rather unfortunate habit of being attacked and beaten up by gangs.
Being attacked, did you say?
Yes, beaten up and other things. Happened to me, but it was happening to a lot of people, so I wasn't exceptional in that sense. But it does concentrate your mind on gangs because they were very much a major feature of the local reality. From that first study, I've really become very convinced that gangs are critical social phenomena. So I have this unique longitudinal perspective of 25 years, almost 30 years, on the way the gang has evolved in a particular neighborhood, and also encountering multiple generations of gang members.
Today, Dennis is a professor of anthropology and sociology at the Graduate Institute in Switzerland. In 2019, he launched a large global research project called Gangs to explore the commonalities across gangs, gangsters, and ganglands around the world. Part of the project included collating the life stories of 31 gang members, most of whom joined their gang at a young age. This included people across 23 countries, from South Africa to France, Bangladesh, Honduras, and Sierra Leone. Each story was documented by a researcher who'd spent time with a specific person.
Life histories are particularly interesting generally. They humanize people. And a lot of research on gangs has been carried out of social work. It's been about trying to also fight against stigmatizing images of gangs as evil and so on. And a life history immediately is something you can be more empathetic with. And so I was very attracted to that.
So based on what you've managed to pull together with this large group of researchers who you've worked with, what are some of the most common factors that have led people into gang life?
The common factor is that there aren't any real common factors. There's a great variability. We have in our heads stereotypical factors, abuse, broken families, lack of a male figure, poverty, etc. But they rarely apply very consistently.
But Dennis says even if there are many factors involved, some of them do increase the likelihood of somebody ending up in a gang.
Exposure to violence does seem to have an impact. Not so much in terms of trauma, but more in terms of being able to be violent is something which also allows you to be a gang member. Having had a family member who was or who is a gang member is also something, but it's weakly correlated. It's not an inevitability. Personality clearly plays a major role, but more often that is very idiosyncratic. Poverty, for example, is a context. It's not a cause. One must always remember that even if gangs can be associated principally with poor urban neighborhoods, most youth in those neighborhoods do not join gangs. It's normally 2, 3, 4% of youth in a given neighborhood join the gangs. There is one factor that did emerge from our research, which is it's a negative factor. And that's actually quite interesting because it also confirms something I'd seen in Nicaragua before, which is religion actually seems to play quite an important preventative role, where youth who come from religious families who are religious rarely join gangs.
But even then, Dennis says, it's often chance and circumstance that play a bigger role.
In the course of my own research in Nicaragua, there have been individuals whom I thought, wow, this person really has a kind of personality. They would be a gang member. You talk to them, and at one point they had been quite close to the gang and gravitating around it, and then they got a job. So then they were taken out of that context. Gangs are part of a broader youth culture. In at any one point in time, youth will be hanging out with gang members in the streets. In Nicaragua, they'll play basketball or football against each other. Being connected to a gang doesn't automatically pull you into it or pull you back into it.
Okay, Dennis. So one of the people that you've included in this Life Stories project is Gaz from Sierra Leone. Now, Gaz is someone who was profiled by your colleague Kieran Mitten at King's College London. And Kieran has kindly put us in touch with Gaz too. Why do you use Gaz's story so striking amongst all of the stories that you've heard in this project?
I've known Kieran for a while now. I've read his excellent work on gangs and rebels in Sierra Leone and also in Brazil. And when he told me about Gaz and his trajectory, I immediately thought, wow, this story is quite amazing. And Gaz is clearly a remarkable individual. But what really stays with me is his determination to use his experience as a means of trying to help others in similar situations overcome adversity.
Hi, Gaz. Hello?
Hello.
Hello? You can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi. When I spoke to Gaz a few weeks ago, he was in his house in Makeni, a small town in central Sierra Leone. We spoke over WhatsApp. He doesn't have easy access to a computer, and you can hear the bustle of daily life behind him. So, Gaz, tell me about your childhood and how and where you grew up.
My childhood is somehow crazy. I grew up with my mom and dad and my 4 siblings.
Gaz grew up during the Sierra Leone Civil War, a brutal conflict between government forces and rebels that ravaged the country in the late 1990s.
Our father was a soldier. He was working for the Sierra Leone military. Even though his salary was not that good, but he uses that to take care of us, bring food to the house. Our mom was always take care of the other things. So we were moving on with life, pretty good.
Millions were displaced by the war, including Gaz's family. They had migrated from Makeni to his father's village in the north of the country.
We spent some time there thinking that the rebel will not get to his village. But they spread all over, they touched all over. So we returned back to Makeni.
When the situation in the capital, Freetown, looked better than it was in Makeni, Gaz and his mother left, looking for shelter in the capital.
The rebel, they never stayed there for long. So the city was somehow peaceful for other people.
Gaz started going to school again, but then the war ended.
And after the disarmament and the reintegration, people were getting back to their normal places. We came back to Makeni. By then, I was still a child, but I was in secondary school. By then, I loved to play football. I was into football, you know. After school, I'll find space for me to go to the field and practice. But my father never wanted that. So just after the war, in 2003, my father retired from the military. So then it was not working.
Each morning, Gaz's mother would go to the market to sell clothes, expecting him to take over after school. But instead, Gaz would often skip this responsibility.
I'll come at home, change my uniform, then take my football gears, then I'll go to the football field to practice. So there is where I started having problem with my dad. Like I said, he was a soldier. That kind of strict, you know, soldiers, they are just strict, you know, even with child and their wives. So he never plays with us. If you break any of his laws or rules, he will discipline you. And I started having confrontation, you know.
Eventually, Gaz's father would force him to leave every couple of weeks.
You don't want to be under my control, you need to go and find your place. So that's how he keep on sending me out of the house. I'll come back, move around to elderly neighbors, apologize to them for them to come on my behalf to my dad so he can accept me back. in the house.
By the time Gaz was 16, he decided he'd had enough of living with his father.
I said, no, I will not continue this. I need to find my way. By then, I was a teenager by then. So I decided to leave McKinney.
Around this time, he also sat his senior secondary school exams.
In fact, that result was withheld by the West African Examination Council. But for me, I always blame my dad for that because he was pressuring me.
Without a formal school certificate, that's when Gaz decided to leave McKinney.
I moved to Freetown by myself and I went to be by myself. There was no relative for me that would lodge me or take me to his house. So I was having friends there since I've been there before. During the war break when we get there, I was not going to school. Eventually, that's how I found myself in the ghetto.
Instead of joining an existing gang, Gaz set up his own.
I formed a clique that I call Give a Damn with some of my other friends. We named Give a Damn Squad. We bow down to no man.
It wasn't easy for young guys who already had a clique or gang to break away and join Give a Damn Squad.
We decided to look out for fresh people, the young guys that are coming to hang out just like I was.
This was in an area called Exodus Lane in Freetown.
You can find ex-combatants. It's a deadly zone that even the normal people in society wants their children not to associate themselves to that area.
The gang's day-to-day activities often revolved around doing dirty work and thuggery on demand. In one common scenario, a woman would pay the gang to intimidate a rival in a love triangle. It wasn't about killing, but about harassment and control, stealing a phone, causing trouble, or making the rival's life difficult. These small but constant acts of intimidation were a routine part of the gang's operations.
Sometimes people that are having this land conflict, the landowners, they will sell land to one person, and if that person travels overseas and never come back for like 1 or 2 years, they will sell it to another person.
2 or maybe 3 people end up in conflict over the same patch of land. Gaz and his gang might then be hired by one party to clear the land of any structures, even while the case was making its way through the courts. Life in the gang could be hard. They were sometimes attacked by rival gangs, beaten up by police, and Gaz spent time in prison too. He continued in this way for over a decade until he was about 27. But eventually, the way of life began to weigh on him.
I'm that kind of person that is so much attached to my family, more especially my mom. Even while I was in the streets, I have this consciousness that my mom, this is not the life that my mother wanted me to live. And I have to quit this life one day and make mama happy and make mama proud, live a better life that is appreciated by society.
Gaz began thinking about his place in society.
People only come to us when they want to do evil things, bad things to society. They will never come to us when good things are happening.
Gaz told me about a time when construction began of a new road by a company from nearby Senegal. As part of the development, the company asked local community leaders to suggest some young people to work as labourers on the project.
So what happened during that time? They went ahead and select the good youth that are doing good and ignored us. So I started thinking to myself, now, we are youth and some of us don't have a job. Maybe that's why we are doing what we are doing.
The incident with the construction firm and the realisation that his mother had grown increasingly distant left a lasting impression on Gaz. He decided to share a cunning idea with members of his gang who he felt were conscious of the same issues.
So now, the strategy that I apply, if anybody comes with a deal, a mission, I have this land, I've bought this land, blah, 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 I want you guys to go and destroy this fence or the palm body, the structure that is there, I will say, okay, we'll negotiate the price and agreed on a certain amount. So when they gave me the deposit, I will share the money to my boys. Then we will not go into any mission.
Gaz figured that nobody he'd tricked in this way would report it to the police. They wouldn't complain that a group of young guys they'd paid to go and do bad things hadn't actually gone and done those bad things. Gaz's plan worked out for a while, and he was able to make a bit of money. It was around this time that he came across an international charity called Way Out, which dedicates itself to improving the lives of vulnerable young people through the arts.
I went to Way Out for a recording because while I was in the streets, I was a rapper, I was doing music. And I heard about, there is an organization that's come in town that's giving help to less privileged and street youth. You go there, they will give you a song and even give you a video.
At the charity, Gaz received a lot of encouragement to start writing.
During my time of recording those songs, I heard about poetry, that they are doing poetry there also. And so I became interested into this poetry. I never knew much about literature. But one good thing that was in me, I love to write. I write a lot. And I made it try, okay.
Gaz flung himself into poetry. And as well as poetry, he's also dabbled in writing short stories as well.
My writing is based on my experience, motivation, hope, perseverance. It's all my writings are based on.
Gaz eventually started sharing his poetry on Facebook and joined various online groups. His work soon caught the attention of the African Writers' Conference, a literary organisation in Uganda, which invited him to participate. He was also approached by a journalist from the Pan-African Writers Association, a Ghanaian-based cultural institution. However, Gaz was unable to attend either event because he didn't have the funds. Although he was enjoying the work in poetry circles and he gained a level of recognition, including some international media attention, he soon realised that he wasn't able to make ends meet as a poet. So he returned to gang life, selling Kush, a potent drug made using cannabis, fentanyl, tramadol and formaldehyde. Fast forward, and with the money he made, he built a small shack, which he was able to rent out.
The place where I was living by then was my place. I acquired the place out of the street because I was the head of the gangsters and we were doing land bulldozing for landowners. They gave us that land. So while I was into the Kush game, doing dealing on the Kush, and so the money that I was making, I constructed like 2 rooms and a parlor and a room and an apartment.
Gaz had an idea, though, to leave life on the streets and head back to Makeni and start a farm with some of the guys from his gang. He already had a daughter, and his partner was pregnant and living in Makeni. He tried to raise the money to buy land for the farm from an NGO in Freetown, but that didn't work. And so he decided instead to travel to Dubai and find a job. That didn't go well, and after a few months, he left, heading straight back to Makeni. He managed to hustle enough money to buy some land and equipment and start that farm.
So I bought my machine, I bought an old bike, and select handful of my guys. So we are now together doing it. Though it hadn't been easy, the challenges are so much, but I'm enjoying it.
What are you growing on the farm?
We are doing granules, pepper, cucumber, cassava, and cocoyam.
In 2022, Gaz lost his entire farm to a fire. But undeterred, he started again from scratch. The people that work with him on the farm today are all former gang members.
The guys that I used to affiliate with, hang around with, and when I came back, I tried to bring some, because that's the mission, to help take people off the streets, bring them to see the reality of life. So now, as I'm talking, I can boast of up to 32 cooperative members.
So 32 cooperative members, all from former gang members?
All former gang members.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate it. Good luck.
All right.
Keep strong.
Yeah, you too.
All
you
right.
Too.
Thank you now. Bye. Another of the life histories collected for the Gangs project is a bit closer to home for Dennis Rogers. It's about a man from Nicaragua that Dennis calls Milton, though Milton is a pseudonym to protect his identity. Now, this is somebody that you've been in touch with for years, and you know a lot about him and his life. So tell us about how you first came in touch with him.
I first met Milton very simply. He was a kind of happy-go-lucky 16-year-old who was a junior member of the local gang that I was studying in Barrio Luis Fernández Hernandez, a poor neighborhood of Managua, the capital city of Nicaragua, where I do my research. And I met him in the streets. We got talking. I was very close to the gang, and they knew that I was doing research about them, and I was interviewing them and so on. And he was particularly affable.
We should say we tried to speak to Milton for this episode, but unfortunately it wasn't possible. How would you describe him then as a person?
He's quite soft-spoken. He's quite a big person as well. He's somebody I think he considers things. He's not very impulsive. He's a bit of a thinker. He's somebody who will observe, who will listen. He's also somebody who's pretty equanimous. He's got a very even temperament, unlike some of the other gang members who can be quite impulsive. He's actually a very nice guy to have a beer with. He was 9 years old when he joined the gang with his mate Bismarck, because they were the first neighborhood gang emerged around 1989, 1990, and was made up of 18, 20-year-old former conscripts from the army. And Milton and Bismarck, he said, we were bored. School was shit. We'd hang out in the street, but there was nothing to do because this was the tail end of the Sandinista revolution.
This was a period of major political and social upheaval in Nicaragua, led by the Sandinista National Liberation Front, which had overthrown the US-backed dictatorship there in 1979. The Sandinista regime faced fierce opposition from rebel forces funded by the US, and Nicaragua plunged into a brutal civil war that left the country in ruins and with a political vacuum.
It was a period of deprivation, of economic crisis, and institutions, including school, was falling apart. Milton and Bismarck started hanging out with the gang members that they found much more interesting, asking them about their experiences as soldiers and where they traveled in Nicaragua and so on. And so they kind of became like mascots. And when the first generation of gang members retired, they quite naturally became the kind of more prominent leaders of the gang, which very much institutionalized, became a kind of going thing that even if members retired, you'd have new members being recruited.
The gang Milton joined had first emerged as a group of people trying to protect their families and friends amid spiraling insecurity and crime. This began to change with the arrival of drugs in the neighborhood.
The gang became more predatory, became linked into drug dealing. And while the logic previously had been to keep outsiders outside of the neighborhood, now it became about making sure that outsiders could come into the neighborhood to buy drugs. And that meant that rather than being violent towards outsiders, it became about being violent towards insiders who might prevent outsiders from coming in.
Eventually, faced with bleak prospects in the gang business, Milton quit in the late 1990s.
Partly because he did not like the ethos it took on of becoming predatory. He actually went off to Costa Rica to work for 7 years, and he saved money, and then he came back as a kind of former gang member. He was left alone and was respected. And he tried to set up a corner store with the savings that he'd accumulated. But corner stores in Nicaragua are kind of like a dime a dozen. You have them all over the place, and they have very low profit margins. And so actually, he then decided, I don't really want to continue this. I'm going to get into drug dealing instead. So what Milton did is he established a network of trusted clients who would text him whenever they wanted drugs. And he would then deliver the drugs on his bicycle whenever they wanted.
In 2011, the drug trade in Nicaragua collapsed as a result of government crackdowns and the capture of a major drug lord. Milton, yet again, found himself without any prospects.
And then he made the, what at first glance would seem quite paradoxical decision to set himself up in the tortilla making business instead. His mother was a tortilla maker, and but she was getting old and wanted to give it up, as he told me. And he said to her, so why don't you let me take over?
Milton told Dennis that his idea was to draw on his experiences of selling and delivering drugs to instead deliver fresh tortillas.
He would basically take orders for tortillas from people by text, and now he does so by WhatsApp, and have tortillas made by a bunch of people that he hired on demand. And then he would deliver them himself, first on a bicycle and now on a motorcycle. And there's actually 2 other people going on motorcycles as well. It's remarkable. As I said, the normal model is for an individual to make 150 to 200 tortillas a day. He's making 3,000 tortillas a day. And this gave him, in the mid-2010s, a monthly profit of approximately $800, which is a huge sum in a Nicaraguan context where the median wage was around 150 at the time. And you could actually see the way in which this has actually really profited him. I mean, his house is one of the few houses in the neighborhood to have a second story, which is something that only drug dealers had. So he's also kind of using his profits to live the conspicuous consumption lifestyle of a drug dealer, which is quite interesting, but doing so through making tortillas.
And so he was essentially using the same technique that he'd used in the gang as a drug dealer to do the tortilla distribution.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the use of mobile technology, just-in-time delivery, which has enabled him to gain an edge on the existing tortilla sellers and has established the basis for this exceptionally profitable mode of financial capital accumulation within a field which normally has a very low profit margin and a very traditional means of operating.
But in 2018, things took a troubling turn when the government of the current president, Daniel Ortega, proposed reforms to the social security system. Thousands of people took to the streets to protest against the reforms and an increasingly authoritarian regime. The government responded with violent repression that resulted in hundreds of deaths.
Milton was not actively involved, but went to a couple of opposition marches. And the government's quite paranoid. It has actually cracked down on anybody who is not declared undenied loyalty to them. And so Milton had to go to Costa Rica to kind of get away from possibility of being threatened and also extorted, because the current government is now extorting local businesses in order to kind of make money. A lot of the Nicaraguans in Costa Rica are quite paranoid because they're being surveyed. So he changed his phone. And so it was a bit complicated getting back in WhatsApp contact with him. But he basically is currently working on a coffee farm in northern Costa Rica and hoping that things will soon change in Nicaragua so they can come back.
So his tortilla business essentially allowed him to transition away from gang life. He was no longer involved in the gang, or was it still there on the periphery of his life?
No, it allowed him to transition out of it. I mean, in any case, in Nicaragua, there is a kind of common saying that there is no such thing as an old gang member. It's quite normal for gang members to leave the gang after a certain age. It's part of a kind of more general life cycle thing. But I think what Milton's life does show, as does the life of several other gang members, is that you can transition out, you can be successful, but success can be short-lived. But that has less to do with having been a gang member and more to do with the kind of broader circumstances in which they find themselves.
What do both Gaz and Milton's journeys, their trajectories, reveal about how former gang members attempt to rebuild their lives once they've left?
One of them is having been a gang member does not condemn you to a particular kind of trajectory. There are all sorts of different trajectories. This is something which is shown more widely by the Gangs Project. I think you also need to look beyond violence and criminality to understand them. So yes, Gaz draws on his gangster experience as the subject of his poetry and then for his leadership skills in running his collective farm. But they're not the only things which have shaped his post-gang trajectory. And it's the same thing with Milton. His just-in-time tortilla selling business, yes, draws on his gangster past, but its current problems have less to do with gangsterism than anything else.
Dennis says that when some gang members do manage to leave, the skills they've acquired can also be used to help others leave the gang too.
It's something that we can see in many other life histories collected for the Gangs Project, including, for example, that of Sharif, who belonged to a street gang in Bangladesh and has now become a prominent child rights activist, or a former triad member in Hong Kong who became an evangelical pastor and founded a gang ministry specifically to evangelize gang members. In both those cases, they draw on their past experiences to help them try and mitigate some of the kind of negative aspects of being a gang member.
What factors would you say from these histories that you've collected would influence someone's ability to leave gang life successfully in the ways that you just described?
It's very variable and personal. Over the course of the 25 plus years that I've been researching the issue, in no particular order, having children was an important one. Marriage, experiencing a violent trauma, for example, being severely injured in a gang fight, being in prison, becoming bored, having a lucky escape, being conscripted into the army, emigrating, a death in the family or moving away from the neighborhood, having a friend being killed in front of them, or parental pressure, or evangelical religious conversion, being betrayed, or finding employment. And from some of those, you can see it's pretty clear that a lot of being able to leave the gang is being occupied by something else.
Just as these kind of life events can help someone leave a gang, Dennis has identified other factors that seem to be counterproductive.
If you do a review of gang kind of prevention or gang assistance programs, the ones which have been consistently most successful are those who provide opportunities. Repression rarely works, certainly not by itself. Repression, if you actually look worldwide, tends to lead to gangs becoming more professional and perhaps transitioning to becoming more organized criminal groups. As I said, not all aspects of gangs are negative. They are also kind of groups where individuals learn to be themselves, that provide them with identity, provide them with certain skills and so on. And sometimes they can be very much seen as something positive by the community, being embedded in the community and respectful of local community. But most of the successful ways of tackling gangs have involved dealing with more structural issues. So in that sense, that's where we have to then make the leap away from thinking about gangs as a phenomena and think about them. How do gangs fit within society more broadly? And perhaps this is where certain types of gangs reflect the way a gang includes people, and the emergence of other types of gangs, perhaps more predatory ones, reflects the way in which societies can perhaps be more exclusive and discriminatory.
Thanks so much, Dennis.
Thank you very much for having me on your program today.
That's it for this week's episode. It was inspired by a series of articles first published on The Conversation France, chronicling some of the life histories from Dennis Rogers' Gangs project. That series was put together by our former colleague Claire Chakravarti and has now been published in English too. We'll put a link to where you can read the series in our show notes. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani with production assistance from Katie Flood. Sound design was by Michelle Macklem and our theme music is by Nita Saul. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor and I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks for listening.